It is February. The power has been out for 6 hours. Your pipes froze an hour ago. You have a fireplace you have never used, and a stack of decorative logs that came shrink-wrapped from Home Depot, and you are standing in front of them with a lighter, in your own home, in your coat, and you do not know what you are doing. Your youngest comes into the room and asks if she can go to her friend's house because her friend's house is warm. You say yes. You watch her go. You sit down on the couch under a blanket, and you feel something that is not fear exactly, and not shame exactly, but lives in the same neighborhood as both. Because you are a grown adult and you cannot keep your child warm. Now I want you to sit with that. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She grew up in eastern Kentucky, in a house with no electricity, and no running water, and no furnace. And she raised 4 children in that house, and not one of them ever spent a night in it cold. She kept them warm through winters that dropped to single digits using nothing but what was around her. She fed them from a root cellar and a smokehouse, and a garden that she understood at a level that would make a modern agronomist pause. She treated their fevers and their cuts from what grew along the fence lines. She made the soap they bathed with, and the candles that lit their evenings, and the lye that cleaned their floors. She did not call any of this survival. She did not call it homesteading. She called it keeping house, and she learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, and she assumed, the way you assume with things that have always been true, that someone would be standing close enough to her when the time came to catch what she knew before she died. Nobody was standing close enough. Ruth died when I was 19, and I have spent the 30 years since then tracking down, piece by piece, everything she knew that left the world with her. What I found is what I am going to give you today. 10 things my grandmother Ruth knew that the electric company and the grocery store and the pharmaceutical aisle would very much prefer you never learn. And I need you to understand before we begin why those 3 specifically are the villain of this story. Because it matters. It matters to why you were sitting on that couch in your coat in February. It matters to why your daughter went to someone else's house to get warm. When central heating became a product that companies could sell, those companies had no incentive to tell you that a properly managed wood fire in a masonry stove heats a home more efficiently and at lower cost than their system. They had every incentive to let that knowledge fade, to let the people who held it die without passing it down, and to position their product as the only reasonable alternative to freezing. When the grocery store chains expanded into every rural county in this country, they had no incentive to tell you that a root cellar stocked from a kitchen garden could feed your family through winter for almost nothing. They needed you to not know that. When the pharmaceutical distribution system reached every small town, there was no profit motive attached to documenting which plants along your fence line had genuine medicinal properties that 3 generations of women before you had relied on without question. The knowledge did not become wrong. It did not stop working. It became unprofitable to teach. And in a world that teaches loudly what is profitable to teach, and lets everything else go quiet, it went quiet. Ruth's knowledge went quiet with her. And a whole country of people who could once keep themselves warm and fed and healthy from what was around them became people who sit in their own living rooms in their coats, waiting for a utility company to turn the power back on. I want you to get that power back. Not the electrical kind, the other kind, the kind that lives in your hands. The first thing Ruth knew was how to heat a room without a furnace, and she knew it the way she knew how to breathe, without consulting anyone, because it was just part of how you lived. She knew that heat rises, and that the greatest enemy of a cold room is a high ceiling. So the first thing you do in serious cold is hang a heavy blanket across the ceiling of the room where people are sleeping, drop the ceiling height by 3 feet, and trap the warm air down where the bodies are. She knew that a clay or brick surface absorbs heat from a fire slowly and releases it back slowly, for hours after the fire has gone out, which is why the old farmhouse hearths in Kentucky were built thick and wide, and why that stone was still warm to the touch the morning after a fire the night before. She knew that a single candle inside a small clay pot set inside a slightly larger clay pot, with the outer pot inverted to trap and concentrate the heat, produces a focused, radiant warmth that heats the immediate area around it in a way an open candle never could, because the clay soaks up the heat and gives it back as a steady low warmth instead of letting it rise straight to the ceiling and disappear. She knew that two bodies under a proper quilt, a real quilt, thick and pieced and insulating, generate enough heat between them to stay genuinely warm in a room that would otherwise be dangerous. She knew that warming a brick in the fire and wrapping it in wool cloth and placing it at the foot of the bed was not sentiment. It was stored heat, thermal mass doing the work after the fire had gone down. She knew that the most important thing about a wood fire is the draft, and that a cold chimney has no draft at all, and that you must warm the flue first with a piece of burning newspaper held up inside it before you build the main fire, or the smoke will come back into the room instead of going up and out. None of this required a product. None of it required electricity. All of it worked. She knew all of it automatically, without thinking, because she had done it every winter since she was a child, standing beside her mother doing it. The second thing Ruth knew was how to keep food without a refrigerator, and she did not know one method for this. She knew 5, and she knew which food wanted which method, the way you know which child wants which kind of comfort. Vegetables she fermented. A crock, water, non-iodized salt, and thyme. Cabbage became sauerkraut in 5 days. Cucumbers became real pickles, not the vinegar-soaked imposters in the grocery store, but living probiotic pickles that stayed crisp and kept for months at root cellar temperature, without any processing, without any heat, without anything but salt and the bacteria already present on the vegetable's skin. She kept a crock going from late summer through early spring continuously, pulling from it and adding to it the way you might manage a sourdough starter, and the flavor of what came out of it was nothing like anything you can buy, because what comes out of a fermentation crock is specific to the bacteria present in that kitchen in that season, and those bacteria are not the same anywhere else. Meat she smoked and cured. Salt drives moisture out of meat and creates an environment where the dangerous bacteria cannot survive. Smoke adds antimicrobial compounds to the surface. Drying finishes the work. A properly smoked and cured ham hanging in Ruth's smokehouse kept for months and needed no refrigeration because the process had made it shelf-stable through chemistry, not through cold. Fresh produce she root-cellared. Cool temperature, high humidity, darkness, and minimal airflow. In those conditions, carrots keep for 5 months, potatoes for 7, winter squash for 6, beets and turnips and cabbage all winter long. The root cellar is not a primitive refrigerator. It is in several ways a superior one, because it does not dry food out the way mechanical refrigeration does, and because it requires no electricity, and because it can hold a volume of food that would fill 4 modern refrigerators. Ruth did not think of these as techniques. They were just what you did with food. The idea of throwing food away because it had been in the refrigerator too long would have been genuinely incomprehensible to her. The third thing Ruth knew was how to grow more food in less space than you would believe possible if you had only ever seen a modern garden. She did not grow in rows. She grew in layered, interplanted, dense beds where nothing was wasted and everything was working. Tall plants shaded the low plants beside them that needed relief from the afternoon sun. Climbing plants used the tall plants as their trellis. Deep-rooted plants broke up and aerated soil for the shallow-rooted plants growing beside them. Nitrogen-fixing beans fed the corn they climbed, and the squash spreading at their feet. Strong-smelling herbs and flowers at the borders of every bed confused and deterred the pest insects that navigate to their host plants by scent. She never bought fertilizer. She fed the soil with kitchen scraps and aged manure and wood ash and leaf mold, and she understood the difference between feeding a plant and feeding the soil that feeds the plant. And she understood that the second one is the only approach that works across decades. She saved seeds from her best plants every year, always from the best, always from the plant that had performed most strongly in her specific soil, in her specific climate, against her specific pest pressure. And over the years and then the decades, those seeds became something that no catalog could sell you, because they had been shaped by that specific land. A commercial seed variety is bred for broad adaptability. Ruth's seeds were bred by her choices over 40 years for one hillside in eastern Kentucky, and they outperformed anything from a catalog on that hillside every single season. The fourth thing Ruth knew was how to treat the medical problems that actually fill most of a family's year, and I want to be direct about what that means and what it does not. Ruth was not opposed to doctors. She used them when the situation genuinely called for it. What she understood was that the vast majority of what goes wrong with a body in a year does not require a physician, and never did. A cut that needs cleaning and closing, a fever that needs watching, an infected splinter that needs drawing, a cough that needs loosening, a burn that needs cooling and covering, a stomach that needs settling. Ruth had a response to every one of these, from what grew along her fence lines and what she kept in her pantry, and she had those responses not because she had read about them, but because she had used them, repeatedly, on her children, and watched them work. Plantain, the broad-leafed weed that grows in almost every unmowed patch of ground in North America, was her drawing poultice. Crush the leaf, apply it to a splinter or a surface infection, cover it. The active compounds in plantain have been studied in the laboratory, and the antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory mechanisms are real. Yarrow was her wound treatment, pressed directly onto a cut that would not stop bleeding, and yarrow's hemostatic properties are documented in medical literature going back centuries. Garlic was her antimicrobial, eaten raw for internal infection and applied crushed to surface infections. Elderberry, which she put up in syrup every fall, was her flu prevention and her flu treatment, and the clinical research on elderberry's effect on influenza duration is peer-reviewed and published, and available to anyone who wants to read it. Ginger for nausea, chamomile for sleep and inflammation. She did not know the names of the active compounds in any of these plants. She knew what each one did and how to prepare it, and she knew, which is the part that cannot be written down, when the situation had gone beyond what she could handle, and a physician was what was needed. That judgment is the most important thing she had, and the hardest thing to transmit. The fifth thing Ruth knew was how to make what she needed instead of buying it. And the three that matter most in this world right now are soap, candles, and lye, because these are the three things that disappear first and fastest when a supply chain breaks down for longer than 2 weeks. Soap she made from wood ash and rendered fat, water poured slowly through packed wood ash in a container with a hole at the bottom drips out the other end, as lye water, potassium hydroxide, dissolved from the ash by the water passing through it. That lye water combined in the right ratio with rendered lard, heated slowly and stirred for hours until it thickened to the consistency of pudding at a stage called trace, then poured into molds and left alone for 6 weeks to cure into hard, usable soap. The ratio matters. Too much lye makes soap that burns skin. Too little makes soft, greasy soap that does not clean. Ruth knew the ratio by experience, and by the feel of the soap at trace, and by the way the surface looked during the cure. That knowledge does not live in the recipe. It lives in having done it enough times that your hands know. Candles she made from tallow, rendered beef fat, using cotton wick she kept on a wooden spool. She dipped them by hand, lowering a length of wick into a pot of melted tallow, pulling it out, letting it cool, dipping again, building up the candle layer by layer, until it was the diameter and length she wanted. 20 dips for a working candle, 40 for a long one. A good tallow candle burns for 5 hours. She made them in batches every fall, and they lit the house through winter. There was no drama in any of this. It was production. It was the household producing what the household needed, because that is what a household is, or was, before it became a unit of consumption instead. The sixth thing Ruth knew was how to build a fire correctly, and I need you to understand that most modern people do not know how to do this, and the gap between knowing and not knowing becomes critical at exactly the moment when it is too cold and too dark to learn by trial and error. Ruth knew that fire needs 3 things in precise balance: fuel, heat, and oxygen, and that when a fire fails, it is always because one of those 3 is wrong. She knew you start with the finest dry material available: dry grass, crumbled dry leaves, paper, the thinnest dry twigs, and you catch that material first before you touch anything larger, because the most common reason a fire fails is that someone tried to catch a large piece of wood with a small flame, and the large piece of wood won. She knew that wet wood does not burn, It steams and smokes and chokes a fire and builds up a flammable resin in the chimney called creosote that causes chimney fires, and she knew that wood must season for at least a year after being cut before it burns clean. She knew that a cold chimney has no draft, and that before you build a fire in a cold fireplace, you must warm the flue with a lit piece of newspaper held up inside the opening, so the warm air establishes the upward pull that makes the fire draw rather than smoke back into the room. She knew that the coals left after a fire burns down are better for cooking than the active flame, because coals give a steady, controllable heat that the flame does not, which is why every piece of serious cooking in her kitchen happened over coals, never over open fire. She knew hardwood from softwood by weight and grain and smell, and she knew which burned long and which burned fast, and which was best for what purpose. This is not complicated knowledge. It is observational knowledge, built across decades of daily practice, and it transfers readily to anyone willing to practice it, which almost nobody is, until the February night when they need it and have nothing to practice with. The seventh thing Ruth knew was how to read the sky, and she read it well enough that the men who farmed around her trusted her read over the radio report when the two disagreed, which happened more than you would expect. She knew that a ring around the moon means ice crystals in the high atmosphere, which means moisture is being carried overhead on a warming front, which means rain or snow within 36 hours. She knew that a red eastern sky at morning means moisture is already in the low atmosphere to the east, while weather builds to the west, which is what the old saying, "Red sky at morning, sailor, take warning," is describing. Not poetry, meteorology. She knew that when the cattle in the lower field all moved to the high ground and faced the same direction, a pressure change was coming, because cattle feel barometric shift through their bodies before any instrument registers it. She knew that swallows fly low before rain, because the insects they eat fly low when pressure drops. She knew her own body, which joints ached in which way before which kind of weather, and she trusted that information the way a mechanic trusts an unusual sound from an engine, as data, specific and reliable data, built from long, careful attention. Weather forecasting is pattern recognition. Ruth had been doing pattern recognition on the sky above that particular valley for 40 years by the time I knew her. The forecast was speaking in generalizations about a region. Ruth was reading the specific sky above her specific land, and her read was more often right. The eighth thing Ruth knew was how to find and manage water without a tap. She knew that willows and cottonwoods grow where their roots can reach groundwater, so in a drought the tree tells you where to dig. She knew that in the morning, the greenest patch of vegetation in a dry field is almost always sitting above a subsurface seep. She knew that a clean roof is a water collection system, and that a single inch of rain on 1,000 square feet of roof produces over 600 gallons of water, enough for a family's non-drinking needs for weeks. She knew that rainwater from a clean roof is safe without treatment for gardening and washing, and safe for drinking after either boiling or 6 hours in direct sunlight in a clear container, because ultraviolet radiation kills the biological contaminants in collected water as effectively as any chemical treatment. She knew the difference between the spring on the property, which she trusted, and the creek at the bottom where the cattle stood, which she boiled. She knew which source was right for what purpose, and she never conflated them. Ruth did not buy water. The idea would have seemed to her like buying air. She understood water as something present in the land around her that she had learned to read and find and manage, not something that arrived through a pipe controlled by someone else. That distinction between a resource you understand and access and a service you depend on and pay for is the distinction that put her on one side of the February problem and us on the other. The ninth thing Ruth knew was how to build the kind of community that means you are never truly alone in a crisis. And I want to be precise about what this means because the word community has been so softened that it barely carries weight anymore. What Ruth practiced was not neighborliness in the gentle modern sense. It was a system of continuous practical exchange, of labor and food and knowledge and presence, that created bonds of genuine obligation and trust between households over years and decades. She knew who in the 2 miles around her had medical knowledge, who had the equipment for a specific job, and would lend it without being asked twice. Who was struggling that season without showing it? She showed up. That is the whole of it. She showed up when someone was harvesting and needed hands. She showed up when someone was sick and needed meals left at the door. She showed up when someone buried a husband and needed a person to sit with in the kitchen without speaking. She showed up before she was asked, because she understood that waiting to be asked is waiting for the person to spend the hardest currency they have, which is the admission that they need help, and that the gift of showing up before the asking saves them that cost and binds something between you that cannot be manufactured any other way. That binding, accumulated over years of small, consistent presence, is what she had instead of a generator. 7 households within a mile who would not let her freeze, who would bring wood, who would bring food, who would come in the night without a second thought, because she had been the person who came for them first. That is a different kind of security than the kind you can buy, and in the long run it is a more reliable one. The 10th thing Ruth knew is the one I need you to carry, because the 9 things before this one are methods, techniques, skills that can be learned and practiced. This one is different. This one is the foundation under all of them. Ruth knew that competence is not something you are born with. It is not a personality trait. It is not something you can buy at REI or learn from a weekend workshop. It is a practice. It is what grows in your hands from doing a thing badly, and then less badly, and then well, across enough seasons that the knowledge stops living in your head where it has to be remembered, and starts living in your body where it just is. She did not know these things because she was exceptional. She knew them because she started before she was ready, beside her mother who was beside her, doing them in the real world where the stakes were real, and she kept doing them until they were hers. The crisis is not that the knowledge is gone from the world. It is in old books and in the memories of people in their 70s and 80s who learned it from people who lived it. The crisis is that we stopped practicing. We outsourced the practice to the electric company and the grocery store and the pharmacy, and when the practice left our hands, the confidence left with it, and we ended up sitting in our living rooms in our coats in February, feeling afraid in houses we own. You do not have to stay there. Start with one thing. Build a fire this weekend and learn why it does or does not draw. Put cabbage and salt in a jar and leave it on the counter for 5 days and taste what comes out. Save the seeds from your best tomato this fall. Ask the oldest person you trust what their mother knew that they still remember. Write it down. Do it with your hands until your hands know it. Then stand next to someone younger and show them why, not just what, the way Ruth's mother stood next to her. That is the only way it comes back. That is the only way it ever came. One person deciding the old knowledge is worth keeping, and keeping it with their body, not just their mind. Here is what I want you to understand about that February night. It was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was the predictable outcome of a specific arrangement, one in which the electric company and the grocery store and the pharmaceutical aisle made themselves so convenient and so available for so long that the knowledge your grandmother had in her hands quietly became the knowledge nobody thought to pass down, because nobody thought it would ever be needed again. They were wrong. The grid goes down. The store shelves empty. The pipes freeze. The delivery stops. And when those things happen, you discover very quickly whether you have the knowledge in your hands, or whether you were counting on a system that turned out to be less reliable than it looked. Ruth never counted on that system, not because she was suspicious of it, but because she had something better. She had the knowledge in her hands, and the neighbors at her door, and the root cellar full, and the crock working on the counter, and the fire drawing clean in the hearth. She had the competence that no power outage can take from you because it does not live in a wire, it lives in you. Go get it back. One skill, one season, 1 year at a time. Before the next February comes and your daughter goes somewhere else to get warm.